As you might have noticed, I am totally into ghosts right now. So now I thought I would cover some facts about one of the perhaps most famous Scandinavian undead, the Draug or Drög. Scandinavian old ghosts and undead comes in a wide variety, and they all have their special function and looks. We have the creepy ghost children, mylingar or utbölingar, that are children often born out of wedlock and thus murdered by their mothers. Mylingen I have covered in a special episode that you can find in the description below or up in the right corner. And we have a version of the Will-o'-the-Wisp that called Lyktgubbar, which means a man with a lantern. In some areas, those are believed to be dead land surveyors that didn't do their job right in their living life and now have to forever and ever remeasure the borders of people's lands. I will do a special episode of those later. But now we are going to talk about the Draug, or Gast as they are called here in Sweden. It has many different names depending on where in Scandinavia you are. Draug, Draugar or Drög. Draug is mostly used in Norway. Haugbui and Aftargangna are Icelandic names for them, and Drög or Gast is in Swedish. Draug might have come from an Old Norse word that originally meant something along with to hurt or to deceive. It might also actually just have mean ghost. Later on in history it got connected to mean to drag or move slow and sluggish. Or in Swedish the word drög is a person that is a bit slow and stupid. Haugbui means barrow dweller, pointing to the fact that these types of ghosts very often is haunting an old burial mound. Afturgangna means something along with again walker or the one that walks again, which we also have a version in Swedish, gengångare, that has the same meaning. Sometimes the Draug are the same as a gast in part of Sweden. Gasta means to loudly scream. In some other parts, a gast is their own being and not Draug. Yes, as usual, you will get different answers depending on who you ask and where you ask. Scandinavian folklore is a bit tricky that way. The common among all of these beings, Draug, Draugar, Haugbui or Gast, are that they are not spirit ghosts. Here in Sweden, some researchers have come up with the name likspöken, which means cadaver ghosts. They are more like revenants, corporeal ghosts that have transformed from a normal dead person into a new kind of being. In a lot of ways similar to what we might call a zombie today, but still with magical powers so that they can change form and weight. They can come out of their burial mounds like black smoke to then take physical form. They seem to have the ability to move through the earth and stones, and they sometimes can be invisible. In some stories, it can change its form to become huge or very small. But regardless of size, it is usually very heavy and often tries to crush their victims to death with their own weight. Very often they are described as having either blackened necrotic skin or being very, very pale, sometimes bloated and sometimes really like a rotting corpse. It also usually possesses extreme strength and a rotten stench of death around it. Yeah, these beings are not something you would want to meet in a dark road or a dark forest. They are horrifying. Other magical powers that are mentioned are the ability to look into the future and controlling the weather, and also being able to shapeshift. In some stories, the being turns itself into a huge, heavy cat and sit on their victim's chest, slowly suffocate them under the crushing weight. Well, I can see where that inspiration comes from. Anyhow, neither of these extra magical powers, like seeing into the future, controlling the weather, or shapeshift, are the most common traits, but they do appear. There are other ways they differ from the modern zombie. Zombies usually are described as rather unintelligent, single-minded creatures. The Draug still has a certain intelligence with them, but it is twisted into being sadistic and it thrives on hurting others. The Draug are tied to haunt a certain piece of land. usually in form of an old burial mound, as I previously mentioned, where they very often guards a treasure. Either it is their own, or they were so envious in life that they crawl down into some other rich person's mound and guard their treasure as their own. Sometimes it is near a road that lead towards or close to their burial mound. The stories are filled with these tales about how these evil beings haunt an area, like a road or a piece of the forest, and thus made it impossible to use that place for anything, because it was dangerous to even go near. And this brings us to the reason it has become a draug in the first place. People that died and become a draug has been very evil in life, and for some reason this is almost always a male being. So far I have actually never heard about a female draug. Why that is not something I have an answer to. I have some theories that perhaps it just wasn't proper back in medieval days to portray a woman as a stinking, rotting corpse that liked to crush people by sitting on them or hugging them. But I'm a bit unsure if this really can be the only reason. There are other beings that are female and that certainly not are portrayed in any nice and fluffy manners. Maybe it was so that when these stories was written, like the Icelandic sagas where we so often meet this creature, the treasure they are guarding was not something that was considered to be really owned by a woman, but by a man. That is also a bit wonky, because we do have female burial site that has huge wealth and treasures in them. And the sagas tells us how the Viking women often were strong, independent women that was very much involved in having their own businesses, working in the politics, and often consulted the men that was the front leaders. Maybe even though the women seem to have had a lot of control over their own economy and also the household's economy, all the gold and silver still was regarded as owned by the man. Or maybe women just aren't as evil as men. Well, why these creatures so often are male is something I have to leave unanswered. But this brings us to the fact that this being is very old. Just the fact that it usually haunts burial mounds might point to that, but as I already mentioned, we also have a lot of stories about people turning into these horrifying creatures from the Icelandic sagas. There is mention of them in both Laxdala saga, Njál's saga, and many more of them. And Odin himself are in some stories called Draugadrottin, which means king of the draugs. The idea of body and soul being separated in life is not something that seems to have been a common thing in the Old Norse sagas. This idea that ghosts come back with body and all has lived on strong in the Scandinavian minds. Later on in history, perhaps when the burial mounds was so covered with grass that people forgot about them, the draug very often became connected to people that had drowned, making the appearance of them no less horrifying, since the corpse then looked like a bloated drowned person that been in the water for ages. Not a very nice sight. But the draug still kept a lot of their behavior from when they dwelled in their burial mounds. It is usually on a special piece of shore where the draug lived, and very often people had to start avoiding that shore to not get killed by the evil-spirited corpse that lived there. In the older tales from early medieval times, the draug usually had to be killed a second time, but normal weapons would not always do the trick unless you cut the head off, like with a modern zombie, or drive a wooden stake through them, just like you're supposed to do with vampires. The best way was of course to burn the body. The draug actually have more similarities with both zombies and vampires. Some of them kill the living in some of the stories, and they eat the flesh, and in some they also drink the blood. As mentioned earlier, they often tried to crush their victims by the heavy weight, and if they choose to be invisible, they could sometimes sit on people's wagons and make it impossible for those horses or oxes to move it. In Sweden, you could also be gastkramad, which means hugged by one of these ghosts. That might sound nice and cuddly, but what it really meant was that people could feel how an invisible force hugged them around the chest so they could not breathe. Sometimes this has also resulted in other type of sickness, like nose bleeding and coughing of blood. A person that was gastkramad could be so sick that they died. The examples from the Icelandic tales of the Draug are many, and the most famous is perhaps one I haven't mentioned yet, and that is Glam from the tale of Grethe. Later on in history there are some other rather famous Gastar or Draug here in Sweden too. I have talked about one of them from Gotland, Taksteinan, in another video here on my channel, and there is numerous examples of other Draug beings in Sweden. Taksteinan is based on a real person, and the stories probably have been talked about due to rather cryptic inscription on a 13th century tombstone after Nicholas Taksten. Paul Rasmus from Halland is another example of a famous gast. Paul Rasmus have also developed out of a real person, a bailiff named Povel Rasmusson that lived between 1647 and 1715. If this man really was such an evil, hard-hearted man that put fear into his people, is just as with Nicolaus Taksten, impossible to know. We have very little proof from either of them. From Povel Rasmussen we have rather few sources that points towards him being not more unfair than other noblemen was during the 17th century. But one thing that could have become a reason for the people portraying him as so evil and making him a popular choice for a Draug is that he took the Swedish side in the Swede-Danish war that was going on during his lifetime. The people that lived in the area was on the Danish side, he taking the Swedish side. That's probably why he got such a bad reputation that there still is stories told around him today. The stories around Paul Rasmus is usually borrowed from a lot of stories that you can find all over Europe, both stories about ghosts, the devil and other beings, and is just adapted to the local area, as folklore so often does. There are stories about how he invites a brave and unscared soldier to do a horse race, just like the famous headless rider in other stories. That soldier soon understands the danger he has put himself in, and he barely survives before he manages to save himself into a tavern where they can hear Paul Rasmus scratch inside the chimney to try and crawl down to kill them. They shut the throttle just in time before he gets in. In other stories, they tell about how heavy a horse-drawn wagon could be if you drove past the old tree where it was said the ghost of Paul Rasmus was living in. A very common motif in stories around the Draugs and Gastar. There are also the stories about how a priest finally managed to get rid of the old ghost and reading him down in his grave again. But, of course, there is a but in this story. Paul Rasmus only agreed to go back to his grave if he, for every 7th year, was allowed to take one big step back towards the church. And when he reached the church, he would be free from the grave again. And you can see that he is closing in because there is a path from where he is buried towards the church where the grass has withered. And every 7th year, that path becomes a little bit closer and closer to the church, if it isn't so already that he have reached it. The stories about ghosts have changed in modern Scandinavia, though you can't visit an old house or castle here in Sweden without hearing something about a grey lady or an old owner that is opening and closing doors, turning on the lights and so on. The stories about Draugs or Gastar are a thing of the past. Maybe the thought of a corporeal ghost in these modern times are just too far out there. But that idea is something that still grows strong in our minds, and that is clear. Just look at all those versions of this being that now have moved into fantasy literature, role-playing games and TV series. One thing is for sure, and that is that because of all these old stories about dead murderous ghosts that haunt the old Viking burial mounds, a lot of the burial mounds have been left in peace by our ancestors. Something modern days archaeologists are very happy about, and that have preserved a lot of our ancient history. Thank you so much for listening to this. I hope you like it and give it a thumbs up. By all means, please share and comment and subscribe too. My plans now for the autumn up to Halloween, or Allhelgonaafton as we call it in Sweden, are to concentrate on the ghostly bit of Scandinavian folklore. Next up, there might be an episode about the Mara, a nightmarish female monster that visits you when you sleep. And like I previously mentioned, I am also planning to do an episode about Lyktgubben. But until then, take it easy in the woods and don't go and disturb any old burial mounds if you find one. Because even if there might not be anything like a draug there, we still want our ancient history undisturbed. Hej Kisse! Hej! Ja, jag kommer katten. Lugn, du ska få mat.